10 seconds. That is the standard penalty in Formula One for causing a collision. It is written down. It is not a suggestion, and it is not a starting point for negotiation. 10 seconds. At Spa, on the 19th of July, the stewards looked at Lewis Hamilton's first lap contact with George Russell, decided he had caused it, and then handed him 5. Half. Hold that, because that halving is the thing this entire video turns on, and almost nobody has picked it apart. Let me lay out what actually happened cold, with no adjectives, because the facts do the work here. Opening lap at Spa. Russell's Mercedes suffered an electrical deployment problem through the first sector, which cost him speed on the climb toward Les Combes. He lost ground to both Ferraris. Then he braked extremely late around the outside into the corner and looked to have taken the place back. Hamilton's front left wheel caught the side of the Mercedes. Russell spun, ended up in the gravel, and his race was over on lap 1. Now the stewards' written reasoning, and I'm going to give you their language rather than mine because their language is the evidence. They found that Russell had established sufficient overlap around the outside and was entitled to racing room. They found that Hamilton's car experienced understeer through the corner, that he applied corrective steering to try to avoid the contact, and that contact happened regardless. They found the collision was caused by his inability to maintain sufficient separation. And then they wrote down that they recognized several mitigating circumstances and reduced the standard sanction from 10 seconds to 5. Read that document on its own, and it holds up. It is coherent, it is internally consistent, and it explains itself. I want to be honest about that from the start, because this channel is not in the business of pretending a reasonable document is a scandal. Subscribe before I go further, because the second half of this is where the comparison lands and you will want it. And drop a comment telling me which country you are watching from. I read them, and this channel gets watched in places I never expected. Now, Ferrari's response, and this is where it stops being about one corner. Fred Vasseur spoke to F1 TV and to the assembled media after the race. His first line was the emotional one, and it is the one every outlet clipped. He called the penalty mega harsh. He pointed out that Russell had space on the left-hand side, that he was nowhere near the wall, and that for him it was a racing incident. That is the quote that traveled. That is not the quote that matters, because when he was asked directly whether the penalty was unfair, Vasseur gave a completely different kind of answer. He did not talk about the corner at all. He talked about the season. He said yes, it was unfair because so far, that season, all of the incidents on lap 1 had been considered racing incidents. All of them. That is not indignation. That is a description of a pattern of decisions, race after race, from round 1 up to that Sunday afternoon. Cars touch in the opening chaos, the field is packed 3 abreast, the stewards note it and wave it through as the ordinary cost of a standing start. That was the operating standard. And then, at Spa, on lap 1, in a corner where the injured driver himself said it was just racing, that standard produced a penalty. So, follow the chain, and let me put this under proper pressure. Question 1. Did the stewards think Hamilton was fully at fault? No. If they had, the number would have been 10. They halved it. That halving is an admission in itself. They were looking at a driver they judged to be partly responsible, in circumstances they explicitly recognized as mitigating. Question 2. What were those circumstances? Understeer, corrective steering, an attempt to avoid contact, and a first lap where cars are tightly packed. Every one of those, by the steward's own account, applied. Question 3. Are those circumstances unusual on lap 1? They are the definition of lap 1. Understeer in dirty air behind another car, a corner arriving faster than expected, an attempt to avoid what is already happening. That is not an exceptional set of conditions. That is what the opening lap of a Grand Prix is. Question 4. And what had the stewards done with exactly those conditions every other time that season on Vasseur's account? Called them racing incidents? Question 5. And this is the one I cannot get past. If the conditions were ordinary, and the driver was judged only partly responsible, and every comparable case had been waved through, what changed at Spa? That is the gap, not a conspiracy, a gap in the reasoning that nobody has filled in the 4 weeks since. Now, the man in the gravel. George Russell had every incentive on this earth to want a penalty issued. His race was over on the first lap. He scored nothing. He was in a championship fight of his own, and the driver who put him there was his own former teammate, the man he replaced at Mercedes. He said it was a racing incident. That is what makes Spa different from an ordinary complaint. The team boss saying it was harsh is expected, that is his job. The victim saying it was racing is not expected at all. Hamilton said the same, and a few days later, in Hungary, he put it on the team radio, in words that are now part of this season's record. He said the stewards had been handing out penalties like crazy, and then that every opportunity he gives those stewards, every single time they give him a penalty. Now hold that thought, because it has just widened. Because Vasseur said something else after Spa that got almost no coverage, and it is about a completely separate sanction from the same afternoon. Ferrari were also fined for an unsafe release. A mechanic was still adjusting Hamilton's front wing when the car went to pull away, and the mechanic fell as the light went green. Ferrari were fined €30,000, 10,000 of it suspended. Vasseur's explanation of that was procedural, and it is revealing. He said the confusion came from a double pit stop with a front wing adjustment only on the second car, and that the team deliberately did not speak on the radio during the 5 seconds of the penalty, because if they had started talking, the mechanics could have jumped on the car early. And then his conclusion: it is not the mistake of Lewis, so look at what that means. The 5-second penalty forced Ferrari into a silence they would not otherwise have chosen. That silence produced a communication failure in the pit box. That failure produced a second sanction and a fine. One decision on lap 1 generated a second penalty 40 laps later, through the procedure itself. That is the compounding nobody accounted for when they wrote 5 seconds instead of 10. Here is your impossible choice, and I want it answered in the comments. You are the stewards at Spa. Option 1, you apply the standard 10 seconds for causing a collision, consistent with the written guideline, and you effectively end Hamilton's race in a title season. Option 2, you call it a racing incident like every other lap 1 contact that year, and you tell a driver whose race just ended in the gravel that his weekend is worth nothing to anybody. There is no third door. Pick one. Like this video if you would have called it racing, comment if you would have given the full 10. That is the vote. And hit subscribe while you are there. Now let me convert this into the only currency that matters in August, which is points. Hamilton finished that race 4th. He said afterward that it was an unfortunate weekend, and he took responsibility for the crash in third practice that wrecked his setup, saying that with the car right, he believed he could have been 5th, 3rd, or 2nd. Vasseur said the penalty cost the team a lot. Hamilton said the recent decisions cost him a lot of points. And here is the arithmetic that makes those statements concrete. Hamilton went into the summer break 2nd in the Drivers' Championship, 50 points behind Kimi Antonelli. Across the 3 weekends that contained this Spa penalty, that gap moved from 45 to 50, 5 points, roughly 1 position in 1 race. That is how a championship gap grows without a single dramatic robbery. 5 seconds here, 3 grid places there, a fine on top, spread across 3 weekends until the deficit has quietly absorbed the value of a strong result. Now go back, because Vasseur said something months earlier that reads differently now. Long before Spa, back when Ferrari were being criticized for their approach, Vasseur was already publicly resisting the idea that the team should be more aggressive. He said he did not really understand the concept of being aggressive, that they were simply trying to find performance, and that things like a rear wing direction are a matter of design rather than attitude. That was reported as a team boss deflecting pressure. It was not. It was a man saying that he expected outcomes to follow the written standard rather than the mood of the moment, which is precisely what he was still asking for at Spa, about a completely different rulebook. There is a structural reason this keeps producing arguments, and it has nothing to do with anybody disliking anybody. Stewarding panels rotate. The 4 people in that room at Spa were not the 4 from the previous round, and will not be the 4 at the next one. They arrive, they read the same written guidelines, they receive the telemetry and the video, they decide under Sunday afternoon time pressure, and then they leave. There is no memory in the people. Consistency is supposed to live in the document. But a phrase like sufficient separation is not a number. Neither is racing room. Neither is mitigating circumstances. Those words require 4 human beings to agree on what they mean this weekend, and a different 4 next weekend, with nothing but the written guideline connecting them. That design produces total rigidity, where a sensor measured the offense, and wide variance where it did not. And lap 1, by definition, is where sensors measure nothing. I should be honest about where my knowledge stops. I do not know what was said inside that room at Spa. I do not know how long the discussion took, whether anyone on the panel dissented, or whether the pattern Vasseur described was even raised. Nobody outside those 4 people does, and anyone who tells you otherwise is guessing. Now, the strongest case against everything I have laid out, and it deserves stating properly rather than knocked down. Russell was ahead. That is not opinion, it is in the verdict. He had established overlap around the outside before the apex, which under the driving standards guidelines earns him the right to racing room. The car behind then failed to keep clear. Understeer is not a defense because a driver is responsible for the car he is driving, and every driver in that field was in dirty air on lap 1 and did not put anybody in the gravel. You could also argue that the pattern claim cuts the wrong way. If every earlier lap 1 incident was waved through and not one of them had ended somebody's race in the gravel, then Spa was not the exception to a standard. It was the first case that reached the threshold. That is a serious argument, and I am not going to pretend it is weak. But it does not explain the halving, because if Russell was entitled to the room and Hamilton failed to leave it, and that is the whole of it, then the answer is 10. The written standard is 10. The moment you write down that you are giving 5 because of mitigating circumstances, you have conceded that the ordinary conditions of lap 1 applied here too, and ordinary conditions on lap 1 all season had been called racing incidents. Subscribe before the reading because Zandvoort is next, and lap 1 there is the direct test of everything in this video. So, the reading. Nothing here proves anybody targeted Lewis Hamilton, and I want to be exact about that. Because the second a channel starts asserting motive, it stops being worth your time. I cannot see intent. Neither can you. 4 people made a call in a room in Belgium and wrote down why. What the record shows is narrower and harder to dismiss. A governing body applied half of a written penalty, on the grounds that the circumstances were partly excusable, in a category of incident that it had spent an entire season declining to penalize at all. The driver who was hit called it racing. The team principal named the inconsistency publicly and on the record. And the sanction produced a second sanction through the team's own procedure before the race was over. That is not an accusation. It is a legitimate question, and it is this. If 10 seconds is the standard and 5 is what you give when the circumstances are ordinary, what is the number when the circumstances are ordinary and every comparable case was waved through? Ferrari never got an answer. They still have not. Zandvoort is the test, and it arrives fast. Turn 1 there is tight. The run down to it is short, and the opening lap has produced contact in that braking zone more than once. Watch what gets written down. Watch whether the phrase racing incident comes back. Tell me in the comments what you think that steward's room does on the first lap at Zandvoort. I will be reading everyone. Like the video if the comparison landed, subscribe so the Zandvoort coverage reaches you, and I will see you until the next one.